Good afternoon, colleagues. Warm welcome to this second workshop by this Cross-Sector Partnerships Initiative on the future of international development business models, with a particular special focus today on our most important country to the north of Australia, Papua New Guinea, where many of us have strong friendships and are working. So my name is Mark Purcell. I'm the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development, and we're a peak body for 130 Australian non-government organisations working internationally, 60 of them in PNG, and we're proud to be a member of the Cross-Sector Partnerships Initiative. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping first, but before I do, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the country where I'm talking from, which is around Canberra, and they are the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and future generations, emerging leaders, and the Indigenous peoples in all of the lands from around Australia that you're calling in from as well. And I think it's a particularly significant time with the advancement by the new government and the Parliament of the Uluru Statement of Heart, a significant time of change and positive change for Australian Indigenous relations. This session, this workshop, is going to go for about an hour and a quarter. I'd ask you to all go on mute, please, except for those that are speaking. If you have questions as we go, you can please type them into the general chat so everyone can see them, or raise your hand. We have some moderators on screen who will be identifying and signalling to Steve and myself as we moderate today if there's any questions. If you have technical questions, though, direct them to ACFID Learning, please, that you'll also find in your chat function. Just to let you know that this session is going to be recorded as well. So the Cross-Sector Partnerships Initiatives is a collective impact endeavour. It has a number of different initiatives, and it brings a number of different sectors together, as its name would suggest, from business, Australian business, non-government organisations, academia, the health medical centre, philanthropy, private capital investors, and government. And we're all looking at ways that we can combine and find alignment and improved approaches to getting greater impact and development outcomes with partners in the many countries where we have collaborations and friendships and are engaged. And so XPI also has a number of its own development research initiatives, which perhaps later on it will come out in the chat. And this second talk today, or discussion on Papua New Guinea, is really coming out of recent research that XPI commissioned with Accenture, which was launched at the previous first workshop we had. It was research conducted by Alex Schmidt and others, and it was called The Role of Cross-Sector Partnerships in NGO Business Models. And what it was really finding, and not to summarise all of it, but that based on research with over 100 different people, that the traditional models of business models of development, particularly for non-government organisations, are changing. So NGOs are often reliant on a couple of sources of revenue, and those revenue sources are increasingly contested because there's so many players competing for attention. There's shifting priorities from donors as well as from governments, where they're driving their own development agendas around the Sustainable Development Goals. So the findings were that business as usual is no longer an option, and the choices are to firstly transform to become more fit for purpose, combine forces more through merging and finding ways to cooperate, or head in the sand, slowly decline and cease. And the development challenges that we need to achieve, which is eliminating extreme poverty on the planet by 2030, which is the agreement that governments around the world came to with the Sustainable Development Goals, are too big for any one sector to solve by themselves. So we need systems approaches, we need greater collaborations, and this is where, this is XPI's core business, is to try and create debate and discussion and opportunities to come together to find ways that we can align better. And that will have results in greater outcomes, cost savings, efficiencies, and capabilities. No one organisation, no one sector has all of the capabilities that we need to tackle the complexity and the multitude of development challenges. And the success factors that were identified are the right leadership, the ability to take risks and fail fast. Secondly, to ensure it is a coherent strategy, transparency and linking to principles and values, compatibility across sectors, finding common values and strengths, and not just talking about it, but actually experimenting and piloting and getting underway. Now, all of these factors of ways of working are relevant to Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is rich in talent. It has many resources, but most important resources are the people themselves, the many people, different peoples, and their skills and local knowledge that they bring to development challenges. And many of you on this call will be working with them. And so today, we want to explore that. It's also important because just today, a new aid policy process has been announced by the Albanese government. It will be getting underway and running through into the new year, and that will inform future, both the direction of Australia's $4.5 billion aid program, which is set to grow, and future budgeting decisions. And so it's really timely because Papua New Guinea is our largest bilateral aid partner to be looking at the situation on the ground. And who better to kick us off and to give us some insights than His Excellency John Carley, who is the High Commissioner of Papua New Guinea to Australia. And it's a great honour to have you join us, sir, and to explain to us a little bit about your thinking and insights from your many years of public service, but also because you are the holder of the key dialogue between the Australian government and your government here in Australia. So welcome, sir. And
thank you, Mark.
To kick us off, I've got an opening question, which is
Sure.
We do have a newly elected government of Papua New Guinea, and could you please explain to us what are the development priorities for the government of PNG and what outcomes are you hoping for, please?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for the introduction, and also to welcome everyone, and also in particular my Minister and Deputy High Commissioner, Mr. Tame, who's joined us this morning. But also to all of you, I really want to thank you for your interest and your partnership in various activities that you are undertaking. And I really am pleased with this initiative, this cross-sector partnership, bringing everyone together. I would like to see the engagement of a number of government departments in this forum in the future, if you don't mind, Mark. My suggestion, because they are key partners, and they are the process owners of many of the decisions that are to be made by the government. And if we are going to talk about effective collaboration, we need to engage with the process owners, which are some of the key sectoral heads, like Secretary for Health, Secretary for Justice, Secretary for Planning, and all, maybe some of the key managers in those departments, to engage them in this discussion. So it's an open discussion, because those are the partners that we are really talking about. Secondly, let me also put my views in perspective. I have come from a central agency where I was a process owner, and I must admit that I'm only starting to appreciate the role of national government agencies, national non-government organizations, after moving away from a central agency. So that goes to show that there's a lack of understanding by government departments of the role, the important role that non-government organizations play in partnering with government, the national government, and local level government in delivering the agenda of the national government. And I have only come to realize the value and the importance of non-government organizations and what they can do. So I have, in fact, taken up patronage of a number of non-government organizations to encourage those non-government organizations to partner with government agencies in Australia and also in PNG, so that we can deliver on some of the things where we lack the knowledge, the expertise, and the resources to make them work. And so the second thing I wish to say is I think we are in a good space right now, because we have two governments who are in power, led by political parties that have a very special historical connection. That is Pangu and Labour. And if you recall, Pangu under the leadership of and Labour under the leadership of those towering figures of late Grand Chief Sir Michael Smyre and Whitlam, delivered political independence to Papua New Guinea. And I, as a student, happened to be a very active player in Pangu's early days. So I have a special connection to the birth and the rebirth of Pangu Party. And its connection with Labour is important. We must understand that. Because now that both are at the helms of both governments, that historical connection is now coming back to the fore. And so Marape has made it very clear that it was Pangu and Labour that delivered political independence to Papua New Guinea. It is now these two governments which must now deliver economic independence to Papua New Guinea. And that is the major message that is coming out. And in order for us to have that economic independence, he has spelled out a number of priorities that he wishes to pursue. But those priorities come under a set agenda, which is the 2050 vision, which of course says that we need to be a happier, a smarter society by 2050, which has been drawn from our constitutional mandate. So this vision and these priorities are not just things that which were invented yesterday or today. They are, founded on the history of Papua New Guinea. And so those are some of the key priorities that Marape has outlined to deliver economic independence. Firstly, infrastructure development to connect Papua New Guinea. To connect Papua New Guinea, you need roads, bridges, wharves, airports, information communications technology. You need energy, but also green energy to support the infrastructure in the country. Because infrastructure, good infrastructure, but sustainable infrastructure will connect every part of Papua New Guinea, but also give access to our people in the rural areas, majority of which are in the rural areas, access to the markets. The second priority, of course, is agriculture development, livestock, in where he has clearly appointed ministers of coffee, ministers of oil palm, which he wants downstream processing in those sectors to encourage more involvement of the rural sector in that. So just making those points, you can see where you can connect later on. Fisheries, forestry, tourism, but you know, and law and order, education and health, I will try and touch on some of the things that he wants done in those as we move on. But because of time limitation, I'll be very quick. In terms of doing that, the first, I believe, is leadership and governance. It's critical if we are to deliver on those fronts. And as we have witnessed, the 2022 elections is not one that we want to be proud of. And if we are talking about stable democracy, we need to address and go back and revisit where we went wrong in the 2022 elections, and maybe reform some of those processes. And so at the end of the day, what the government wants is to give every eligible voter an opportunity to cast a vote by 2027. So upgrade, give access to every voter. Secondly, upgrade the common roll, so everyone is included. And if that happens, I can assure you that we will have more women in the national parliament comes 2027. And that review is as an important agenda that I've made clear to ministers in Australian government, foreign minister, the international development minister, even the deputy prime minister. I said, Papua New Guinea really needs your support in auditing the general elections, because to address the current issue before we move forward is important. And of course, law and order is another priority that needs to be addressed, because there's things that are happening which are causing a lot of consternation for investors. So we need to address that as a key. And partnerships, institutional partnerships in the security area between defense forces and the police are going to be really critical. And I've been speaking to the Commissioner of Police here, and our commanders have been in constant engagement here to make sure that our security space, you know, and the partnerships in that area are addressed.
So, Your Excellency, just because we're coming up against time,
yeah.
Noting those important priorities, what would your advice be in what you would like to see, or your government would like to see, in terms of support from NGOs, business, faith groups?
Yes.
And how would you like us to support the government's agenda?
Well, clearly the government does not have the resources, that does not have the expertise. So it would have to look at partnerships with other governments at the bilateral level, partnerships within our private sector, partnerships with the non-government organizations, and partnerships with the faith-based organizations. Because the government, even though it has a long arm, it may not have the resources in terms of the finances and the human resources or the assets. And so that's where we want you to come in. But our central government is set a vision, and it's really up to the implementing agencies to go out and secure those partnerships with NGOs. But I think the key thing for the NGOs and our implementing agencies must understand is there has to be a common goal. You cannot come in and implement your own agenda. You've got to come in and join us, jointly design, jointly develop, jointly have decision making, and then jointly deliver. I think that is the key message that I want to pass on to all my friends here. even though you are going to be sponsored by donor governments, donor agencies, I think you as the experts who are coming in really need to appreciate that you are here to support a development agenda for the government of Papua New Guinea. So we need to work together. And this is where I am going to try and do a lot of work with our government departments as well, because I've come from there. And there's a very little understanding of the roles that non-government organizations play. And so I think our key agencies have got to appreciate that we cannot do it alone. We need partners from the private sector, from the NGOs and faith-based organizations in order to deliver. But in order to deliver, it's got to be collaboration. You know, there's got to be important that we collaborate. And collaboration means putting our heads together, you know, hugging each other, and you know, sharing our emotions together, and not pursuing our own agendas. I'm really passionate about that.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's a privilege to have you open this forum, and I think both your outline of the government's priorities, but also your recommendations of how we work, but also your heart, which I know from engaging with you on a number of different issues, the High Commissioner does have a lot of experience, but he has heart, and it's about relationships with people. I know
Absolutely.
that you prioritise. Your Excellency, if you have time to stay with us while we just go into the next part of the panel, but if you have time to stay on and participate in short question and answer over the next hour, that would be wonderful.
Of course, of course.
But for now, thank you so much.
My pleasure. And
I'm going to just acknowledge that the founder of XPI, Dan Evans, is also on the call. Here is both the inspiration but the driving force behind the cross-sector partnerships initiative. So great to have you, Dan, and I know you're going to probably coming in a bit later. But now to hand over to Steve Goodsward, who's going to take us in and facilitate this next part of our discussion. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Mark. And yeah, let me echo Mark's comments and appreciate His Excellency's opening with us and setting the stage. So what we're doing from webinar one is that we recognise that there's nothing particularly new about the way to work, the types of funding that we can be chasing. So we wanted to explore why doesn't the system move as rapidly as it should in the direction that it knows it ought to. And if we look at the mix of enablers, complexity, dependencies, power dynamics, strong interest, as Mark has said, from donor governments, established government direction, as His Excellency has outlined. PNG provides us the example of a specific country which reflects the entire system. So we have a wide-ranging panel of Peter from CARE with SAVIT, and Brendan from Burnett, and Tori from Accenture, and Gary from PNG Tribal Fund. And we're going to unpack this question. We're going to really ask the panel to look at what the enablers and the obstacles are for moving business models forward. And we're going to see what are some practical examples, what's working well, perhaps what hasn't worked well, then we need to retire. Let me start with some opening comments from Peter and Savit, and then we'll kick it off from there. And please type in your questions through the panel conversation so that we can get to them in about 30 minutes. Peter, why don't you kick us off, and then we'll move to Savit.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Look, the title to this webinar is The Future of International Development Business Models. And my name is Peter Walton, CEO of CARE. And, I'm going to paint the bigger picture to begin with, because, how the international development works is multifaceted across multiple geographies. I'm a very strong believer that INGO business operating models do need to change, and that we actually do need fundamental systems change. I previously led a major shift in the way that the Australian Red Cross embarks on its international work, and now as CEO of CARE, I've been given a mandate to reimagine how we operate, and going to paint you a picture around why this is the case. And in Mark's opening comments, he made the comment around transformation in discussion with a colleague many years ago. He said the existential challenge for international NGOs was to either transform, to die well or die badly. And somewhat pessimistically, he said that most were on the die badly path. So I think change to international development business models often comes from either leadership and a moral imperative, or it comes from a burning platform. And I would argue that we actually currently have all of these drivers for change converging at the moment. The global inbox for international aid is not only full, I would argue that it's overflowing. And look, some of these examples won't be new to any of you, but we are seeing extreme weather and climate change. And, in this region, climate-related events are not only occurring with increased frequency and greater intensity, but, 1 in 100-year events seem to now be happening many times a year. We're seeing increasing inequality. No country in the world is on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, and all countries still have at least one piece of legislation that discriminates against women. We're seeing more people fleeing conflict and violence, and this is predicted to increase. And we have famine occurring in the 21st century. And of course, the pandemic has caused the erosion of many of the development gains that have been made. And in fact, some estimate that there have been generational reversals in some areas. I would say, importantly, prior to COVID in 2019, there was a 40% shortfall in humanitarian financing to deal with the crises of 2019 as they were responded to at that time. Then we had, of course, a global pandemic. We've got a war in Ukraine at the moment, and I guess a global hunger crisis is unfolding as we speak. And Mark referenced the aid budget before. It is at a low level, and the UK government has its aid budget dropping. So taking all of this into consideration and actually fast forwarding to 2030, when we have maybe 1 billion more people on the planet, a planet that's 1.5 degrees warmer, and you sort of get the picture that it just isn't adding up. So that burning platform alone is, I would say, deeply compelling, that we have to think about ways that international organizations, in solidarity with the countries that we're seeking to support, do seek to operate differently. But above and beyond that, we're also operating in a sector which is being accused of being colonial. It's a sector that is accused of being white saviors. And it's a sector that's accused of having a massive gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And at the World Humanitarian Summit that many of you may have attended probably about 7 years ago now, donors and humanitarian actors made commitments that 25% of humanitarian funding would go directly to local actors. At the time, it was about 4%. It's now actually less than that. And during the last few decades, INGOs have grown exponentially. The infrastructure of head offices, regional offices, country offices is expensive, and typically, the model at the moment is an INGO will win a government grant. It will try and cover a range of costs at the various levels of its infrastructure, and then on a project by project basis, fixed term projects are sort of drip fed to local civil society and local partners, creating a dependency on chasing these projects rather than having real agency. And I think that talks to what His Excellency referenced before around what does truly equitable partnerships really look like? What do they need to look like? But whether or not you subscribe to the aid sector being inherently racist, colonial, or whether you don't, funds are not being applied, in my view, in a way which is adequately addressing current needs, let alone those that we anticipate. And I think that applies pretty much to all countries. So given this, I think that there is a case for change, but why is it so hard? Well, I think we have a triumph of short-termism over long-term shifts, often treating symptoms rather than genuinely shifting the needle and taking a longer-term perspective. If you take, I mentioned I worked with the Red Cross before. The International Committee of the Red Cross provides incredible, impartial, neutral humanitarian work around the world. But in each of its major conflict zones, they've been operating in each of those for about 4 decades. So what is the obligation to shift the needle so that we are actually making changes? INGOs here in Australia largely take on the risk of institutional donors. And clearly, whilst there are often questions around the capacity of local organisations and the construct of aid rarely seeks to address the underlying root causes. We have the myths of you can't trust local organisations, they don't have the capacity. Frankly, this just reinforces the status quo and it reinforces the current ways of operating where funds aren't getting through to the areas that are most needed or done in the right way, I would contend. When I was at the Australian Red Cross, I was actually shocked at the same old pattern of aid after Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, when by many estimations, over 100 international organisations landed on that country and with good intentions, bypassed a lot of the local capacity, bypassed a lot of the local economy. And in fact, in my first speech with CARE Australia, I really contrasted that scenario with what was happening with the catastrophic bushfires in this country. And how would we feel if 100 international organisations descended on our shores and actually started telling us how we should be doing things? I think we all know the answer to that. So after that time, I commissioned some research at the Red Cross saying, well, what would a locally led system look like? And importantly, it used local researchers, local methodologies, and they basically concluded that if an INGO is serious about localisation, if it's serious about the phrase as local as possible, as international as necessary, then they really need to start by changing themselves. Or as one Pacific Islander actually said to me, which was I guess quite a pivotal moment for me, was at times of crisis, what we need is a locally made canoe, but you send in a battleship. And I've never forgotten that. So there is a lot of rhetoric around change. There's a lot of spin around the concept of localization. And when His Excellency speaks about collaboration and partnership, the fact is, it's hard because there are multiple perverse incentives to maintain the status quo. Measures of success in organizations and amongst their boards are still often about continuous growth, about market share, often and sometimes above relevance and impact. Perhaps that reflects the composition of boards. There is actually unconscious bias in so much of the work that is currently done, so it doesn't always support the concept of equitable partnerships. It doesn't support how we present the challenges that we are facing and seek to support various countries in genuinely authentic ways. So I actually think we have got an existential crisis, a moral imperative, and a really fundamental challenge for leadership. So we have a moral imperative to ensure that the spirit of locally led, globally connected, that INGOs evolve to be part of the solution and not part of perpetuating the problem and the status quo inadvertently. And in addition, we are also facing change at an unprecedented pace. And frankly, complex problems will not be solved without some quite different forms of partnership and new innovative approaches to partnership or financing that actually go beyond traditional philanthropy. And I think this is a challenge that organizations must rise to. So broadly speaking, I think that paints the picture of the challenge of how INGOs need to change, but probably don't change. But let me just quickly finish with a quote from Madeleine Albright, which is also something which I think probably applies to this sector. She once said that people are talking to governments using 21st century technology, that governments are listening on 20th century technology and responding with 19th century policy. And it might be a little extreme to overlay that into the international development sector, but I actually think there's some relevance to that. INGOs have contributed so much and have been well intended and have achieved so much, but they really are in need of radical change. Thank you.
Thank you. So, but let's go to you to talk about the sort of PNG context, all the complexity that both His Excellency and Peter have talked about, and give us a perspective from where you see around what the enablers and obstacles are for moving this forward.
Yes, okay, thank you. Well, first, Your Excellency, High Commissioner, I'm much heartened and encouraged by your words. You have validated what I want to say and made it relevant again, because as you talk about the rebirth and maybe the revisioning or returning to the vision of the Pangu Party, I am concerned about the reinvigoration of the local NGOs and the return to the kind of relationships that we once enjoyed with the international NGOs. So my question in the discussion about new business models is really where is the locally led development in Papua New Guinea, and where is the voice, the local voice, and the debate, the dialogue, the debate, and what kind of relations and partnerships do we need? Now, I've been a participant observer meaning I have been living in Papua New Guinea, commencing in 1972, and up until recently, I'm currently living in Australia, especially permanently since 2019. I returned when COVID started, and I have been a practitioner in development for those 5 decades. So I have seen the kind of NGOs that emerged leading up and really living up to the vision that was created at independence, and then the evolution towards the more asserting the vision of the people and the ways of working of local NGOs through the 1990s and up until 2000. And I have also experienced the kind of relationships. I've worked at many different levels, many different kinds of organizations. I happen to have worked in a few occasions with international NGOs, including Save the Children and Oxfam. And in the later part of my career, I worked with the UN, but I've always returned to local NGOs in Papua New Guinea. And from my remote location now, I continue to work with a range of NGOs, some who have been emerging over the last 2 decades. And they are very much in line with what you said. They're the implementers of government policy. And I'm particularly talking about policy to do with ending violence and conflict, and particularly protecting women and girls from all kinds of violence, but addressing what is called tribal conflict, addressing the re-emergence of what is called sorcery related violence. There are people on the ground who are doing this work. They're locally run, locally led NGOs, and they're in a struggle. Their life is a struggle. The leaders are stressed. The workers are stressed. Many of them live in poverty as they do this work. And I've recently been involved with, or I'm currently involved with, organizations that work on environmental conservation, taking their vision from the vision of Papua New Guinea and independence and the goals of Papua New Guinea. Local leaders, local government leaders, actually, who have worked with local conservation and ecotourism projects, and who see how important it is to connect with, to have a voice with local government. So I was with them just last month in Milne Bay, and they were talking about how they need to have a voice in the local government, that local governments need to have an office for NGOs. They need to have a routine dialogue and convening with NGOs, local level and provincial government. And they felt that they once had this, and it's being lost. I've also been working with women who want to start or have started a new organization following their experience during the most recent election. Voice for Democracy and Human Rights is a new organization being forged by women who feel they have been brutally excluded, and their democratic rights, their pathway to leadership have been very unjustly prevented. So they want to forge a new organization. And I've also in the last couple of days talked to the original founders of the organization called PNG Trust, which in the absence of a national convening and coordinating body of NGOs, managed in the 1990s to network and build a movement of very diverse NGOs across Papua New Guinea. And they were able to find a voice in some very critical areas of economic and social development, around structural adjustment, around land registration, etc. And they were quite effective. Now, all of these people, they're struggling, they're stressed, they are looking for the ways that they can also rebirth and revision ways to go forward in development. And in this wider discussion about new business models, I struggle to find examples where local NGOs, international NGOs, and business and private sector collaborations are working. There is a tendency for these kind of partnerships at the, for example, at the Australian end, to understate and undervalue the local organisations and their knowledge and experience, and to disrupt the networks and the communication and the movements that they have built for social justice and for implementing the vision that Papua New Guinea had for what kind of country it wanted to be at independence. There's a tendency also to, in collaboration with the private sector, to build everything fast with money and creating unsustainable demands and expectations among the practitioners and the people that they work with. And it tends to often to be going through the motions and making local organizations just token in their participation. So there's real questions of sustainability. So in all the work that we do, we go back to independence and what were the enablers of independence. It was an exhilarating time, and it was a time where there was a strong national and local connection. So through, I imagine, the movements that you were also, Your Excellency, part of, the students and the workers who mobilized to allow the ordinary citizens of Papua New Guinea to be engaged in a deliberate and conscious dialogue to shape the future of their country and what kind of nation they wanted, what were their goals. And that was informed by people who brought lessons from what had happened in other newly independent countries. And so out of this came the 8-point plan, which was a guideline for locally controlled economic development, local ownership of business, but also support for micro enterprises. So it's taken a very long time for us to see the development of policies around SMEs, for example, and to start to look again at the kind of economic development we were talking about.
Sure.
The national goals and directive principles are also very important, and I feel that because it's no longer a kind of orientation to external workers coming to work in Papua New Guinea, whether they be with church-based organizations, international NGOs, they don't know the history of development in Papua New Guinea, and they don't know how the citizens of Papua New Guinea, what kind of country they said they wanted, and what kind of principles, guidelines and principles, goals and directives they forged together. So I think it's important they know these. I think that it's important that we don't substitute these with what are seen to be external sustainable development goals, and that this becomes a basis of re-educating our governments, the government of Papua New Guinea, the local governments, the provincial governments and national government, reconnecting the NGOs who worked within that kind of framework, and ensuring that there is an appreciation and understanding of that history and of the culture and of the movements that grew out of that, and the capacity of people to motivate, mobilize, bring joy and bring a sense of achievement to the people of Papua New Guinea as they organize around implementing local development within that framework.
Right.
So
thanks for that.
These are things that have been lost, and the international NGO, for all of the things that have just been mentioned about the way those institutions have been built, relationships have changed enormously, power hierarchies have been developed, contracting relationships, requirements and conditionalities that local organizations are burdened by, are stressed by, and very often can't fulfill, and therefore very often fall off the radar. So how do we get back to those? There are models. For example, the things that have been done in Timor, where communities in Australia connect with communities in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
And after listening to presentations on that, I know that those things are possible because the government of Timor, out of its independence grew its civil society, and it respects and honors its civil society. It provides, it has a dialogue with its civil society, and it provides basic operational funding on an annual basis to its key civil society organizations. But it also allows a people-to-people connection and a community-to-community connection between Australia and Timor. And there are so many people like myself, and I think many people on this panel, who have a long-term relationship with Papua New Guinea, who would like to be able to continue to give, but don't want to situate themselves in the new power hierarchies and the new relationships of the distant and the privileged and the local practitioners on the ground. So
that's great. So, but let's bring in Gary Buston, who's been working in this exact area for a number of years, particularly the nexus between local and international and partnerships with business and NGOs, and maybe hear some of his experience of what might be and what we can learn. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you. Apinun Tru, High Commissioner, Hamamaslo Lukimyu na Harem Tok Tok Ployu and Gutla Tru. I'm a funny animal. I sound like a Yank, but I was born in Goroka and raised in the Southern Highlands with all my friends wearing loincloths, and then down in Leh in East Taraka, and then initiated into East Sepik, into the Samanyak clan when I brought a medical float plane operation and lived there. So I guess a couple things from our perspective, because we actually are a local NGO. Papua New Guinea Tribal Foundation is based in Port Moresby. We have offices in Melbourne and in the United States, but those are actually only to bring funding and partnerships to follow our organization's plans and our work and fund our work. As far as the funding model go, I'll just touch on a couple high levels and I won't take too much time, but as far as a funding level go, Tribal Foundation, we operate basically off of our own priorities that are driven by what we see on the ground as a local NGO. So we don't go chasing after dollars that come in from development partners. If they align with us and we're able to work together, then we do. But we focus on three areas. One of the first area is leadership development. The second area is women's empowerment. And the third is strategic medical supply. If you're talking about enablers, I think one of the best enablers would be for the international NGOs to help work with the local partners. And that's going to require a lot of time on the ground and finding out who the good ones are, the ones that are operating off of good values and operating off of principle, and then also operating in partnership with the government. Tribal Foundation always works with the government very closely. There are times when we struggle, to be honest, because there's times when we don't get the follow through that's promised in those areas, but we always collaborate and give opportunity to work closely with the government to follow their priorities. And we are funded by a number of mechanisms. One of them is our private donors internationally. We're funded by corporations who are partners of ours, which have us help them with their charitable works. And then we also are funded in part by the government of Papua New Guinea, and then some by development partners. So I think you have to have a lot of streams out of income in order to be able to be sustainable. And that's one of the things that we work at constantly, is being able to not have one stream of influence, because as we all know, the person that pays the piper calls the tune. And I think we have a lot of foreign influencers who come into Papua New Guinea, some well-intended, some maybe not as well-intended, but they're calling the tunes. And the complaints that we get from our local NGO partners is, we have good ideas, we know what to do on the ground, we're the most efficient, but we're getting almost none of the funding because it's going to people that are coming to tell us what to do or how to do it. And then the flip side of that is, a lot of times the local NGOs don't have the capacity to handle significant amount of funding. So while some of the local partners would like to provide significant funding to them, it's a challenge. But I think we are too top heavy for sure. I think that's a consensus as far as international players coming into Papua New Guinea, and we aren't enabling the local players enough. An example of this, Tribal Foundation has a partner on the ground in the Highlands that is a group of pastors that for many years have gone in to stop tribal wars. They're local guys and they're incredibly good at what they do. So we're able to help provide them with capacity building for their organization. And then we're getting our funded through a partnership with the European Union. This is an area that's working because there's nobody from the outside that's going to be able to go in and stop a tribal war while it's happening, bring conflict resolution. But these are guys that are pastors that have respect for the local people. Nobody's going to shoot them. They're allowed to come in and talk. And what they do works. And so that's really the model I think that we need to follow and grow, is working through partnerships that allow the local people who are on the ground, who are actually doing the work, to be able to do their work. I think one of the enablers is accountability. There needs to be a lot more accountability when it comes to funding for the government of Papua New Guinea and funding through organizations. That's very critical because there's a lot of money coming in, but then where does it go and what's the impact? And I think along with funding, it actually, for those government departments that are really interested in making a difference, it enables them to do better. And so I think that's a component that needs to be maybe increased. One of the challenges is corruption. We deal with a lot of corruption and poor values, and so we have to work to be able to focus on how do we raise people's values and expectation level of leaders and of themselves, and so that people actually do the right thing. And that can't be overstated. As an organization that works across all sectors in Papua New Guinea, we deal a lot with poor values and poor leadership. And of course, it's not only Papua New Guinea. I mean, the United States is Exhibit A, but this is a challenge that we have to focus on. So there's actually a lot of things I could go on about, but I'll be happy to answer questions later on in the process.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Gary. Let's move over to Brendan Allen from Burnett. And perhaps, Brendan, you can pick up on some of these themes of investing in local capacity, development of leadership, and accountability.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, this is such a cool discussion, and thank you for everyone involved in this. Burnett is a slightly different model of an NGO. We're actually a medical research institute that is also a registered NGO and not-for-profit. And our overall business model, while we have philanthropic and development funding streams, we also have quite a strong commercial focus stream internally in developing low-cost technology for LMICs. And one of the tricks for us, or one of the issues for us, is how can we replicate that sort of business model into PNG. But in relation to this, we've been involved in a longer-term 3 or 4 year funded program from DFAT. That is developing a surveillance system for vector-borne diseases. It's an implementation research activity. But what we've focused on, obviously the research outputs and the project outputs, but what we've focused on with this is really developing a partnership-based approach in implementation research. So it's been a big learning curve for Burnett and us involved in that. But it's effectively, and most people on this call will be familiar with the partnership brokers methodology And it's simply that we've applied into the research framework. And it's now a collaboration of around 15 research institutes and organisations. That includes government, National Department of Health in PNG, NACIA, so it really is more of a government research institute and community-based partnership. It's used the similar methodology of developing partnership agreements, and one of the key components of that is regular partnership health checks in that partnership cycle. So after 3 or 4 years, the partnership has developed that there is no burnet leadership, so to speak. It really is a partner-based decision-making forum. The findings from using that approach for us really was the importance of the alignment of cultural values in PNG through that partnership, and using that in the design of our implementation and research activities. It's the co-creation of the agreement, so no one has the primacy of that partnership. And then again in that cycle, the ongoing learning and reflection of is this partnership fit for purpose, and is it working? So that using that partnership-based model, I think, has been really successful for us, and a huge learning curve institutionally. The next step, and the difficult step, or a potential difficult step over the next 3 to 5 years, will be changing the funding model of that, so that we don't have a funding primacy. And similar to what others on the panel have mentioned, how now do we use that partnership model to ensure that the local ownership that is there is now capable and supported to actually use the investment rather than it being held offshore. Sure. So I'd leave that leave that comment there, Steve.
Thanks. So I mean, we're hearing an intentional shift, local leadership, investment in capability, investment in the ability for local capacity to make their own decisions, engagement broadly with local, international, across sectors between NGOs, business and partnership. It is a complex thing to do, and there's a lot here that's about the intent to make that work. I'd like to come back very quickly to see what are the sort of practical examples that are working, because we need to get to some Q&A. Maybe I'll start with Tori just to come up with one example that Accenture can offer.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I might try to fit in 2 quickly. There's a couple of things that come to mind for me in terms of examples of successful innovative partnerships that in the international development space stand out. So challenge accepted to Sabit, who was wondering about some truly collaborative partnerships earlier. One is Project Last Mile, which isn't particularly new and a lot of people will have heard of, but started about 10 years ago that tapped into Coca-Cola's supply chain management and marketing expertise to enable African governments in delivering medicines to hard-to-reach communities. So not PNG related, more broad, but the idea being, if you can get a Coca-Cola product almost anywhere in Africa, why not life-saving medicines? And this was a massive, of course, cross-sector partnership with organizations in the NFP sector, such as the Gates Foundation, partnering with other NGOs, government health ministries, and building off mechanisms and skills already in place in the private sector. So in this case, around supply chain management, rather than reinventing the wheel. And I think some key lessons in this partnership being successful, and what we saw when we were involved with this work in Ghana, is was really being clear from the start about what each actor wanted to get out of the partnership and why they were there, since the goals, of course, were quite different with a lot of those different actors. And also touching on the importance of localization, as Peter and Sabit and a lot of others here have mentioned, the work here was led on the ground. So rather than being top down, for instance, you'd have Coca-Cola warehouse workers in Ghana speaking directly with the people from the local Ministry of Health in determining, for example, distribution routes for vaccines recently. And this was really crucial to that. Another one I'll just quickly mention, another one that a lot of people probably heard of is M-Pesa. Also example with the private sector, and also it demonstrates the growing influence of technology and the digital economy and development work, which we see a lot with our work at Accenture Development Partnership. So M-Pesa was born out of a partnership between the UK's Department of International Development, along with some telecom companies like Vodafone, a number of banks. And again, it was using technology that the private sector already had in place to then increase financial inclusion in emerging markets, starting in Kenya. And this has been hugely influential, as we've seen in Kenya. And one of the reasons that this one was so successful was the leadership mindset. And this is something that came up a lot in our research mentioned at the start. So for Vodafone, they initially took it on as a CSR initiative. So they had the freedom and encouragement from leadership to be able to invest in that innovation and adapt it as required without, the pressure of making a return, which of course is harder with some smaller NFPs. It did take them 10 years to see a return on investment. And also this leadership allowed them to be agile and adapt the project as required. So initially it was a small project. However, they realized, they needed to align the app with a wider set of local needs after they did a pilot and were able to pivot. And then again, another successful thing on this one was that localization again. So their partners were on the ground in Kenya, meaning the app was trusted and made scaling it easily. And then last point on that one, also, they were aligning with organizations whose missions were aligned with theirs. So for instance, they were speaking with the Kenyan financial regulators directly, who also had that goal of increasing access to the finance system in the region. And so this helped accelerate the adoption. So just a couple of sort of large scale examples there of some complex partnerships and things that really worked for them in terms of sustaining some impact in that regard.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone. I would like to unpack a lot more, but let's go to some of the questions from participants. And we'll start with Brian Begonia's question about what is the one thing that we can do differently from tomorrow. So we've talked about a lot of big things. We've talked about intent. We've talked about working against the short-termism or however Peter talked about it. But I'm going to come to a couple of you and just to say, what's your recommendation for the one thing that players on this call can effectively do? So let me start with Peter.
One of the circuit breakers, I think, in terms of genuinely supporting local civil society is around breaking the funding model that actually creates dependency. So shifts towards genuine multi-year core funding supported by institutional strengthening under the basis of a truly equitable partnership. But core funding is a circuit breaker so that local organizations aren't locked into that perpetual cycle of project dependency.
That's true, and the growth aspect that you talked about. Gary, what would be your recommendation for one thing?
I think listening. I talk all the time to partners about you have to have context before you can understand the situation and make a difference. Mm-hmm. And I think going in and interviewing, talking to local people on the ground and asking them about what their priorities are and how they let them drive the conversation instead of have the conversation be driven from outside. So I think, and it sounds really simple, but it's actually monumental. Sitting down and listening and really understanding context, listening to understand what it's local solutions, local problems, and driving it from there forward. Yeah. And the question from Rachel talks about the government money comes with processed conditions, and oftentimes the system rhetoric is facing towards the community,
but it's set up for the accountabilities in the process for the donors. How do we advocate well for the flexibility of partnering that His Excellency referred to, the core funding that Peter's talking about, and the long-term nature of investing in partnering? Brendan, some of your thoughts.
This is a question that we're really asking with the country team at the moment, and one of the things that we're raising is can be more of a fund holder is probably not the right term, but because we do have the resources and we do have the resources, we do have the compliance. Can we just be a partner to ensure that compliance occurs with the funder and let the funds flow through to the partner and work with them without any other pressures for implementation? And the role of a country office could then be in that capacity building and over time pass on the compliance strengths. But to break that nexus of direct funding, can we be responsible for the risk and allow the local partner to do what they do best?
Sure, thanks. Mark, I see you have your hand up. Is that in relation to this question?
Yeah, just briefly, Stephen, just building what Brendan said, for those non-government organisations or indeed, Australian businesses that might be receiving funding from the government, from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I mean, you're in a situation where you've got contracted responsibilities that you need to put onto your partners around control and security of funds. And in a sense, there is less discretion, to manoeuvre when you've got that donor legal contracted relationship. But it is a political risk that the government is trying to manage of a negative perception in the Australian public of aid monies going missing or misused. Let's be really clear about that. And that's what the system is designed to do, even though the amounts might be, relatively small, hypothetically. Secondly, around localisation, there's not a clear position from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and apologies to any DFAT colleagues on the call, but there are tensions within the organisations. There are proponents of localisation, or are those that say subscribe to the policy line of zero tolerance for any money going missing, and that needs to be looked at in the light of the new development policy process that has just gone live today, that the Albanese government is initiating to guide its $4.5 billion program. So the details are on the DFAT website, but that policy, they do need to get a position on localisation, and they do need to look at how they manage the risks in a sensible way, because these cascading contracts are not serving autonomy and empowerment of local civil society organisations.
Peter, you said something about core funding and how do you do this in such a confined space? Just a couple of brief thoughts.
Yeah, well, Rachel's question's spot on, and I think that's part of the problem and why we do have perpetuation of the status quo. There's a couple of things. There is an opportunity to sort of collectively influence DFAT around that risk appetite that Mark talks about, because it's a barrier to transformative change in relationships. I'm part of a group called the Pledge for Change, which on the 27th of October, a whole range of global INGOs are going to be making a commitment around how they will change their operating models and collectively seek to influence donors, which I think so that we can overcome some of the reasons why compliance gets in the way of actually making some of the shifts that are going to result in better impact and better support. Importantly, I think the US government has already taken a leadership role in this space, and the administrator at USAID has made a commitment that 25% of the US government's aid program will go directly to local actors by 2025 and 50% by 2030. I think that move in and of itself, if they follow through on that commitment, will transform the thinking of many international organizations and indeed many donors. And I think that's a very positive development.
Sure. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. So if there is any, just type in. But Sabit, if you've got any final thoughts that you'd like to contribute. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I would just go back to the core points that I raised in all of this. And while I understand not all of the issues that have just been mentioned are important, but how within this do we maintain some prominence and visibility for Papua New Guinea's own goals, which were forged with its people and through dialogue, really genuine dialogue and debate and participation? And how do we rebuild in a government and NGO relationship based on recognition and respect within that framework, and that that convening and dialogue and debate become a routine process between government and local government, national and local government and NGOs? And can international NGOs work with and contribute to this so that they have an exit strategy, that they're not building parallel or de facto government services, and they have more sustainable partnerships between government and civil society, with the end result being we build local expertise, effectiveness, knowledge, and lessons are always learned.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Join me in thanking the panel members, Sabit Cox, Tori Stuckey, Peter Walton, Gary Buston, and Brendan Allen. And appreciate you all coming in. I'd like to remind you of the third webinar in this series, which will be looking at non-mainstream ways of engaging in business development, which we will hold on Tuesday, the 29th of November. And that'll be the third in this series. But let me throw it to Mark for a closeout.
Thanks so much. Look, I'd like to finish where we began by acknowledging John Carley as the representative of the government of PNG, but also, you know, as a leader from your own community, High Commissioner. We want to support your efforts to bring development, freedoms, educational opportunities, health opportunities, livelihood opportunities to all the peoples of Papua New Guinea. We stand in solidarity with you and those efforts, and we look forward to working more closely with the government and with the many organisations we're currently working with in Papua New Guinea as we find ways to better collaborate and accelerate partnerships for development. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everybody. And I've been allowed to give a free plug for our conference, which is coming up in 2 weeks' time. So I've just put it in chat. It's looking at sustainable development. So please do join us all for that. The details are in the link there. So but thank you and have a good day, everyone.